something unexpected, maybe unfolding behind the scenes of Roloff Farms. For years, fans believed they understood the farm's future. They believed they knew who would protect it, who would guide it, and who would ultimately carry its legacy forward. But now, that certainty no longer feels solid. Because suddenly, quiet questions have begun to surface. Questions about Caryn Chandler. Questions about her influence. Questions about where she truly stands. And perhaps the most shocking question of all. Is Caryn Chandler being pushed out of Roloff Farms? Or has she quietly stepped into a position of influence far greater than anyone ever imagined? At first, nothing seemed obvious. There were no dramatic announcements, no public statements, no clear turning point. But fans began noticing subtle shifts, moments that felt different, conversations that seemed more careful, and a growing silence where openness once existed. It wasn't one single event. It was a pattern that left many wondering if something important was happening behind closed doors. Because Roloff Farms has never been just land. It represents decades of effort, decades of sacrifice, decades of dreams built piece by piece. It represents family history, personal identity, and a legacy millions of viewers have watched grow in real time. Which means any change, no matter how small, carries emotional weight. And now, fans believe that change may already be underway. The question is, what exactly is happening to Caryn Chandler's role in the future of Roloff Farms? And why does everything suddenly feel so uncertain? Roloff Farms has always been deeply tied to the identity of little people, big world. For nearly 2 decades, viewers watched Matt Roloff turn a modest piece of property in rural Oregon into something far more than farmland. What began as a simple dream evolved into a destination filled with towering play structures, whimsical attractions, pumpkin season traditions, and a legacy that felt almost larger than life. But the farm was never just about attractions. It was about family. It was about the partnership between Matt and Amy Roloff, 2 very different personalities working side by side to build something lasting. Together, they raised 4 children there. Together, they navigated financial strain, business risks, and personal challenges. And together, they created a place that millions of viewers came to associate with perseverance and possibility. The farm became a character of its own. Every fence line, every renovation, every expansion project, each one documented, discussed, and debated by fans who felt emotionally invested in its future. But time changes everything. Matt and Amy's divorce marked more than the end of a marriage. It signaled a shift in the foundation of Roloff Farms itself. The property that once symbolized unity now carried complicated emotions. Ownership questions emerged. Decisions about buyouts, sales, and succession became public topics of conversation. And then there was Caryn Chandler. At first, Caryn appeared as someone supporting Matt behind the scenes. She had worked on the farm for years before their relationship became public. She understood its operations. She knew the seasonal rhythm. She wasn't an outsider walking in blindly. But when her relationship with Matt became official, everything changed. Her presence shifted from employee to partner, from background support to visible decision-making influence. And fans noticed. Some saw her as a stabilizing force in Matt's life, someone who encouraged him to think about his future, his health, and his next chapter. Others questioned how much influence she held over major farm decisions, especially when conversations about selling portions of the property began surfacing. When Matt put part of the farm on the market, it sparked a wave of emotional reactions from viewers. For many, Roloff Farms wasn't just real estate. It was a symbol of continuity, a symbol of something meant to stay within the family. And in those moments, Caryn's role became a focal point. Was she guiding Matt toward practical decisions? Was she encouraging him to step away from long-term obligations? Or was she simply supporting choices he had already made on his own? The truth, as always, seemed layered. Caryn and Matt began spending more time in Arizona. Plans for a different pace of life became more visible. The Oregon farm, once the center of everything, no longer appeared to be the only priority. That shift didn't go unnoticed. Fans began asking quiet but persistent questions. If Matt eventually steps back, where does that leave Caryn? Is her future tied directly to the farm, or is her future tied only to Matt? And now, with recent developments suggesting potential changes in ownership, renovation plans, and long-term direction, the speculation has intensified. Some viewers believe Caryn has already secured her place, not necessarily through ownership on paper, but through influence and partnership. Others believe her connection to the farm could fade if Matt decides to make permanent structural changes. Because here's the reality. Roloff Farms has always been about legacy. It represents decades of work. It represents the childhood of 4 children. It represents the shared vision of 2 people who once believed they would grow old there together. And when a new chapter begins, especially one involving new partnerships, it inevitably raises questions about permanence. Is Caryn building a future there, or is she preparing for a life beyond it? Is she becoming a central figure in the farm's next phase, or is the farm gradually becoming less central to her story? What makes this moment feel different is not drama, it's uncertainty. Matt has openly discussed scaling back. He has talked about health considerations. He has acknowledged that maintaining such a large property is demanding. And when someone begins evaluating the future of something that large, every relationship connected to it feels the impact. Caryn's role may not be officially defined by deeds or contracts in the public eye, but emotionally, her place has grown over time. She has stood beside Matt during major transitions. She has been present during difficult negotiations. She has shared in the public scrutiny that comes with high-profile decisions. Yet visibility doesn't always equal permanence. The farm's future remains a topic of speculation. The family dynamic remains complex, and the audience remains deeply invested. Because Roloff Farms was never just land. It was a shared dream. And whenever dreams evolve, people naturally ask who will remain part of the picture when the next chapter fully unfolds. So now the question lingers stronger than ever. Is Caryn Chandler gradually stepping away from the heart of Roloff Farms? Or is she quietly becoming one of the key figures shaping its final legacy? Only time will reveal which direction this story ultimately takes. Caryn Chandler was never part of the original foundation of Roloff Farms. She didn't build it from scratch. She wasn't there during the earliest struggles, when the future of the farm was uncertain and every improvement required sacrifice, patience, and long-term vision. Instead, her story began quietly. In the background, working behind the scenes. At first, her role appeared simple. She was someone helping manage the daily operations, someone ensuring that events ran smoothly, someone who understood the logistics, the organization, and the countless moving parts that allowed the farm to function as both a home and a public destination. Roloff Farms wasn't an ordinary property. It was complex. Seasonal events required planning months in advance. Visitors arrived in large numbers. Every attraction, every activity, every experience had to be coordinated carefully. And Caryn became someone who understood that system. She learned its structure. She learned its timing. She learned its pressure points. She learned what worked and what didn't. But more importantly, she learned what the farm meant. Because Roloff Farms wasn't just land. It was history. It was emotion. It was identity. For Matt Roloff, the farm represented decades of effort. Every structure, every project, every expansion reflected years of determination. And for those who worked closely within that environment, understanding that emotional connection was essential. Caryn didn't just perform tasks. She became familiar with the deeper meaning behind them. She saw how decisions weren't always practical. They were often personal. She saw how the farm represented legacy, not just ownership. And that understanding gradually changed her position. Not officially, not suddenly, but naturally. Because when someone spends enough time inside an environment, learning its details, understanding its rhythms, and earning trust through consistency, their role begins to evolve. At first, most people saw Caryn as part of the operational side, someone responsible for helping things run smoothly, someone supporting the larger structure. But over time, subtle changes became visible. Her presence became more consistent, more noticeable. She wasn't just appearing during busy seasons or special events. She was present during ordinary moments. Moments that weren't part of public schedules. Moments that suggested something deeper than professional responsibility. And fans noticed. Not immediately, but gradually. Because viewers who had followed Roloff Farms for years understood its patterns. They understood who had always been present and who had not. So when Caryn's visibility increased, it stood out. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. She appeared alongside Matt more often. During conversations. During planning discussions. During transitions that carried emotional weight. And those moments began to reshape how people saw her role. She wasn't just someone working at the farm anymore. She was someone connected to it in a more personal way. And that shift carried meaning. Because Roloff Farms had always been defined by family, by relationships, by shared history. Anyone who became closely connected to that environment inevitably became part of its emotional landscape. Even if they hadn't been there from the beginning. Even if their story began later. Over time, Caryn's connection to Matt became more visible as well. Their interactions carried familiarity, comfort, ease. The kind of ease that doesn't develop overnight. It develops through shared time, through shared experiences, through shared understanding. And as their personal connection deepened, her presence at the farm began to feel less like a professional responsibility and more like a natural part of daily life. This wasn't announced in a single moment. It didn't arrive with a formal declaration. It emerged gradually, quietly, through small, consistent changes. She wasn't introduced as someone new. She became someone familiar, someone expected, someone whose presence no longer surprised anyone. And with familiarity came acceptance, at least structurally, because environments adapt over time. People adapt, roles evolve, and what once felt new eventually becomes normal. But emotional environments are more complex, because Roloff Farms wasn't just a workplace. It was a place shaped by decades of shared memories, by relationships that had endured both growth and difficulty, by history that couldn't be separated from the physical land itself. So when Caryn moved from the background into a more central presence, it represented more than operational change. It represented emotional change. Not necessarily negative, not necessarily positive, but significant. Because when someone becomes part of an environment tied so closely to identity and legacy, their presence naturally becomes part of the story. Part of the future, not just the present. Fans didn't react with immediate judgment. They reacted with curiosity. Curiosity about what her growing presence meant. Curiosity about how relationships within the farm might evolve. Curiosity about how the future of Roloff Farms might be shaped by the people now closest to it. And that curiosity wasn't driven by assumptions. It was driven by observation. Because viewers had spent years watching the farm evolve. They had watched its growth, its celebrations, its conflicts, its turning points. So they understood that even small changes could signal larger shifts. Caryn's increasing presence wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, consistent, And consistency creates influence. Influence doesn't always come from authority. It often comes from proximity, from being present, from being involved, from being trusted. And trust, once established, reshapes environments in ways that aren't always immediately visible. But they are deeply felt. Because trust determines who participates in decisions, who helps shape direction, who becomes part of the inner circle. And over time, it became clear that Caryn had entered that circle. Not through force, not through sudden change, but through gradual integration, through time, through familiarity, through connection. And once someone becomes part of the inner circle of something as meaningful as Roloff Farms, their presence becomes inseparable from its ongoing story. Not because they replace the past, but because they become part of what comes next. At first, the changes were almost impossible to define. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. There was no single announcement. No clear turning point that everyone could point to and say, that was the moment everything changed. Instead, it began quietly. Small differences, subtle shifts in tone, moments that, on their own, didn't seem significant, but together they began to form a pattern. Fans who had followed the journey of Roloff Farms for years were the first to sense it. Because when you watch something long enough, when you see it evolve through seasons, through celebrations, through conflicts, you begin to recognize its rhythm. And when that rhythm changes, even slightly, it stands out. One of the first things people noticed was the way Matt spoke about the future. For decades, his language had been clear and forward-looking. He spoke about expansion. He spoke about ideas. He spoke about creating something that would outlast him. The farm wasn't just his present. It was his legacy. But recently, fans began noticing something different. Not necessarily hesitation, but reflection. A shift from certainty to contemplation. Instead of speaking about long-term plans with absolute clarity, there were moments where his words carried more weight. More pauses. More careful phrasing. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Because sometimes, when people begin to reconsider something deeply personal, their tone changes before their actions do. And longtime viewers noticed. They also noticed differences in how plans were discussed. In the past, updates often carried a sense of momentum. There was always something moving forward. A new structure. A new improvement. A new idea taking shape. Progress was constant. It was part of the identity of the farm itself. But recently, that sense of constant forward motion seemed quieter. Not gone. Just quieter. Plans that once felt immediate began to feel more distant. More measured. As if each decision now carried more weight than before. And that shift didn't go unnoticed. Fans also began paying closer attention to who appeared during important moments. Because presence matters. Who stands beside you during key decisions can reveal more than words ever could. There were times when certain family members appeared less involved than before. Moments when the familiar sense of togetherness felt different. Not broken, but changed. And those changes, even when subtle, carry meaning. Because Roloff Farms has never just been about buildings or land. It has always been about people. About relationships. About shared history. Every path on that farm carries memories. Every structure represents effort. Every decision reflects something deeper than practicality. It reflects emotion. And emotion doesn't disappear. It evolves. Fans who had followed the story closely understood that better than anyone. They knew that change rarely happens all at once. It happens gradually. Through conversations. Through decisions. Through moments that seem small at the time, but later reveal their importance. There was also a noticeable shift in how often the farm itself was presented publicly. In the past, It had been a constant presence, a centerpiece, a symbol. But now, there were periods of quiet. Periods where less was shared, less explained, less clarified. And when something that once felt open becomes quieter, people naturally begin to ask questions. Not out of judgment, but out of connection. Because Roloff Farms isn't just Matt's story. It's a story millions of people have witnessed. And when you witness something grow over decades, you become emotionally invested in its future. Even the smallest changes begin to feel significant. Fans also noticed emotional nuance. Moments where Matt appeared more reflective, more aware of the weight of what the farm represents. Because building something over decades creates a bond that goes beyond ownership. It becomes part of your identity. It becomes part of how you see yourself. And when identity and legacy intersect, decisions become more complicated. Because every choice affects more than the present. It affects the future. It affects the meaning behind everything that came before. And that emotional weight isn't always visible. But it's always present. There were no dramatic confrontations. No clear conflicts revealed publicly. Just a growing sense that something was shifting beneath the surface. Something internal. Something deeply personal. Because change doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with silence. Silence that reflects thought. Silence that reflects transition. Silence that reflects the reality that even the most stable foundations can evolve over time. Fans didn't need confirmation to sense that evolution. They could feel it. Through tone. Through presence. Through absence. Through the subtle emotional signals that reveal themselves when someone stands at a crossroads between what was and what comes next. And perhaps the most powerful part of all was this. Nothing had ended. The farm was still there. The legacy was still intact. The history was still real. But the future no longer felt as predictable as it once had. And when something that once felt certain begins to feel uncertain, even slightly, it changes how people see everything that follows. Because Roloff Farms has never just been about stability. It has been about transformation. About adapting. About moving forward while carrying the weight of everything that came before. And now, fans couldn't help but wonder if they were witnessing the beginning of another transformation. Not loud. Not sudden. But quiet. And undeniable. Control over something like Roloff Farms has never been defined by paperwork alone. It has always been shaped by the people who show up, the people who stay involved, and the people who remain present when decisions quietly take form. Ownership may exist in legal documents, but influence lives in everyday reality, in conversations, in planning, and in the quiet continuity of presence. For decades, Matt was the unquestioned center of that reality. His vision shaped the land. His ideas turned empty space into something meaningful. His determination transformed what began as a personal dream into something that millions of people would eventually recognize. The farm wasn't just something he owned. It was something he created, something he nurtured, and something that became deeply connected to his identity. But over time, as life evolved and relationships shifted, the structure around that influence began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually in ways that only became visible when viewed through the lens of time. Caryn's presence became one of those visible changes. She wasn't someone who appeared briefly and disappeared just as quickly. She stayed. She remained consistent. She became part of Matt's daily life, his routines, and his future planning. And consistency has a way of naturally creating influence, not through force, but through proximity. Influence doesn't require announcements. It doesn't require formal titles. It builds through shared experiences, through trust, through reliability, through being present when decisions are discussed, even when those discussions remain private. Fans began to notice that presence. Not because of any single moment, but because of repeated moments. Moments where Caryn was there beside Matt. Moments where she wasn't just part of his personal life, but part of the broader environment connected to the farm. And over time, those moments formed patterns. Patterns that led to questions. Not accusations, not conclusions, but questions. Because when something carries the weight of legacy, people naturally wonder how that legacy will be protected. They wonder who will help guide it forward. They wonder who will be part of its future when its past has been so clearly defined by one person. Matt's connection to the farm remains undeniable. It is his creation. His vision still exists in every structure and every pathway. But time changes every story, even the ones that once felt permanent. No one remains the central figure forever, in exactly the same way. And when influence begins to expand beyond one person, even quietly, it reshapes how the future begins to look. Caryn's role has never been formally defined in public terms connected to ownership. There have been no official announcements declaring new authority or legal control. And yet, influence does not always wait for formal recognition. Sometimes, it grows naturally through trust. Trust is not created overnight. It forms slowly, through years of shared experiences, through support during difficult moments, through standing beside someone when challenges arise, through consistency when uncertainty appears. And that trust becomes a quiet force, not visible on paper, but visible in reality. Fans recognize that kind of trust when they see it. They recognize the difference between someone who is passing through and someone who is staying. Someone whose presence represents stability rather than transition. And stability changes how people think about the future. Because the future of something like Roloff Farms is not just about who owns it today. It is about who helps shape its direction tomorrow, who participates in the conversations that determine its path, who remains involved as decisions evolve over time. Those questions don't emerge from negativity. They emerge from awareness. From understanding that legacy is not static. It moves, it evolves, it adapts to the people connected to it. Matt's influence remains deeply rooted. His connection to the farm is permanent, regardless of what changes around him. But as his life continues forward, the circle around that influence naturally expands. And expansion brings uncertainty. Not necessarily conflict, not necessarily tension, but uncertainty. Because people understand that influence has consequences. It shapes outcomes. It determines priorities. It affects decisions that may not become visible until much later. Fans don't need official statements to recognize those shifts. They observe patterns. They observe presence. They observe continuity. And continuity tells its own story. Caryn's continuity in Matt's life signals permanence. Not temporary involvement, but lasting presence. And lasting presence naturally leads to deeper involvement in the broader structure of someone's world. That doesn't mean control has changed. But it does mean influence has grown. And influence, even when quiet, matters. It matters because it shapes how decisions are approached. It matters because it influences what is protected and what is allowed to change. It matters because it becomes part of the invisible framework that supports the visible reality. Roloff Farms has always existed as more than property. It exists as legacy. And legacy is shaped not only by its creator, but by those who stand beside its creator as time moves forward. Matt remains the architect of that legacy. But he is no longer standing alone. And that simple truth carries implications, not dramatic ones, not immediate ones, but meaningful ones. Implications about how influence continues to evolve, about how decisions may be shaped in the years ahead, about how legacy transitions from one chapter to the next. The questions fans are asking aren't rooted in fear. They are rooted in care. Because people care about what happens to something that has represented so much for so long. They care about its continuity. They care about its stability. They care about its future. And when they see new patterns forming, new dynamics emerging, and new presences becoming permanent, they naturally begin to wonder what those changes may eventually mean. not because answers exist today, but because the future is always shaped by what happens quietly in the present. Influence rarely announces itself in loud moments. It reveals itself slowly, through presence, through trust, through time. And time, more than anything else, determines how every legacy continues. Recently, fans have sensed something that feels different. Not dramatic, not explosive, but noticeable. It wasn't something announced. It wasn't something confirmed. It was something felt. Because when people have followed a family's journey for years, they begin to recognize patterns. They recognize tone. They recognize presence. And they recognize absence. And lately, that absence has felt more visible than ever. Relationships, especially ones shaped under public attention, are rarely static. They evolve over time. They adapt to circumstances. They respond to personal growth, emotional experiences, and life changes that happen both publicly and privately. And sometimes, those changes create distance. Not necessarily conflict, not necessarily anger. But distance. Distance can be subtle. It doesn't always show itself through confrontation. Sometimes it appears through quieter communication, through fewer shared moments, through the absence of things that once felt consistent. Fans have noticed fewer visible interactions, tied directly to the shared identity of Roloff Farms as a united family space. And that absence has created questions. Not accusations, not conclusions. Questions. Because Roloff Farms was never just about land. It was about connection. It was about shared purpose. It was about a family working toward something larger than themselves. And when that sense of shared presence begins to feel less visible, people naturally wonder why. Is it simply life moving forward? Or is it something deeper? One of the most important realities of time is that priorities change. What once felt central can gradually become less immediate. Not because it loses meaning, but because life expands. New responsibilities emerge, new routines form, new emotional centers develop. And those changes can reshape how people relate to places tied to their past. For Matt Roloff, the farm has always represented vision. It was something he built, something he shaped, something he protected. For Amy Roloff, the farm represented history. It was where she raised her children, where she lived through decades of personal milestones. For Zach Roloff, the farm represented childhood. It was where he grew up, where memories were formed, where identity was shaped. And for Chris Merck, the farm represents something different. Not origin, not ownership, but connection through relationship. Each person's emotional relationship to Roloff Farms exists on its own timeline. And those timelines don't always move at the same speed. That difference in emotional timing can create the appearance of distance, even when the underlying feelings remain complex and deeply layered. Because distance isn't always about rejection. Sometimes it's about transition. Transition from what was to what is becoming. Fans have also recognized that public visibility doesn't always reflect private reality. Just because something isn't shared publicly doesn't mean it isn't present privately. And just because something appears quieter doesn't mean it has disappeared. But silence can still feel meaningful. Silence creates space. Space where interpretation lives. Space where uncertainty grows. And uncertainty naturally leads to speculation. Some fans believe the distance may simply reflect personal independence. That is, each family member builds their own life. Their direct connection to the daily reality of the farm becomes less central. Others believe it may reflect emotional complexity tied to past decisions. Decisions involving ownership, decisions involving expectations, decisions involving the future. Because when something as emotionally significant as Roloff Farms changes, it doesn't just affect logistics. It affects identity. The farm has always represented continuity, a place that remained constant even as life changed. But when continuity itself begins to shift, it can create a sense of emotional disorientation. Not because something is broken, but because something familiar is evolving. Evolution can be uncomfortable, especially when it involves something tied so deeply to family legacy. It raises questions people may not be ready to answer. Questions like, what does the farm represent now? Who does it belong to emotionally? And what role will it play in the future of the family? These aren't just practical questions. They're emotional ones. Because places like Roloff Farms carry meaning beyond physical ownership. They carry memory. They carry identity. They carry belonging. And when emotional distance appears, even subtly, it can feel like those meanings are shifting. But distance doesn't always mean separation. Sometimes, distance is simply space. Space needed for growth. Space needed for healing. Space needed for clarity. Clarity about what the farm means moving forward. Clarity about how each person fits into that future. And clarity about whether Roloff Farms will continue to function as a shared emotional center or evolve into something different. Fans continue to watch closely. Not because they expect conflict, but because they care. Because they've invested emotionally in the story. Because Roloff Farms represents something larger than property. It represents time. It represents effort. It represents family. And when something tied to all three begins to feel quieter, people naturally notice. But silence doesn't always signal an ending. Sometimes, silence signals reflection. Reflection on what has been. Reflection on what has changed. And reflection on what comes next. The future of Roloff Farms remains unwritten. And whether the distance fans sense is temporary or permanent, emotional or practical, one truth remains clear. The legacy of Roloff Farms was never defined solely by proximity. It was defined by the people connected to it. And those connections, even when quieter, still exist. For decades, Roloff Farms has stood as something far greater than property. It has represented continuity. A living bridge between the past that shaped it, the present that sustains it, and the future that will ultimately redefine it. It holds memories that cannot be recreated. Memories of children growing up among its pathways. Memories of celebrations that brought laughter across its open fields. Memories of difficult moments that tested the strength of everyone connected to it. And those memories are not confined to a single person. They belong to an entire family. They belong to everyone who invested their time, their effort, and their emotional energy into building something meaningful together. Because Roloff Farms was never just land. It became identity. It became purpose. It became something that represented years of persistence, sacrifice, and belief. Matt Roloff understood that from the very beginning. He didn't just build structures. He built vision. He built possibility. Every project he pursued reflected his determination to create something lasting. Something that would outlive individual moments. Something that would carry forward. And now, as time continues to move forward, the responsibility connected to that legacy feels heavier than ever. Because legacy isn't static. It evolves. It shifts. It adapts. And sometimes, it faces uncertainty. Matt's decisions moving forward will play a defining role in shaping what Roloff Farms becomes next. Not just in terms of ownership, but in terms of meaning. Every choice carries consequences. Consequences that extend beyond financial value. Consequences that affect emotional connection. Consequences that influence how the farm will be remembered in the years ahead. Because ownership alone does not define legacy. Stewardship does. Care does. Intent does. And those things cannot be measured in documents or agreements. They exist in actions. They exist in priorities. They exist in the willingness to preserve something greater than oneself. Caryn Chandler's presence adds another dimension to that future. Her role in Matt's life has been significant. She has been part of his day-to-day reality, part of his planning, part of his forward movement. And while her connection to the farm may differ from those who helped build it from the beginning, her influence on Matt's decisions cannot be ignored. Because when two lives move forward together, their choices become intertwined. Their visions begin to overlap. Their futures become connected. And that connection naturally affects everything around them, including the farm, including its direction, including its long-term identity. At the same time, the emotional connection that Amy Roloff, Zach Roloff, Jeremy Roloff, and the rest of the family share with the farm remains deeply rooted. Because they didn't just observe its growth. They lived it. They experienced its evolution firsthand. They carry memories that cannot be transferred or replaced. Memories of childhood. Memories of family milestones. Memories of a life shaped by that environment. And those memories don't disappear simply because circumstances change. They remain. They continue to exist in the background. They continue to influence how the farm is seen and understood. Because legacy does not exist only in physical space. It exists in emotional space. It exists in personal history. It exists in shared experience. And when uncertainty surrounds something that meaningful, it naturally creates reflection. Reflection on what was. Reflection on what is. And reflection on what may come next. The future of Roloff Farms is not defined by a single moment. It is defined by a series of decisions. Decisions made over time. Decisions shaped by priorities. Decisions shaped by perspective. And those decisions will ultimately determine whether the farm remains what it has always been or becomes something new. Change is inevitable. That much is certain. But change does not erase legacy. It reshapes it. It redefines it. It gives it new meaning. Sometimes in ways that are expected. Sometimes in ways that are not. What matters most is not whether the farm changes. What matters most is whether its emotional significance endures. Because the true legacy of Roloff Farms was never just its buildings. It was never just its land. It was never just its ownership. It was the people, the relationships, the shared journey, the years of effort that turned an idea into reality. And those things cannot be sold. They cannot be transferred. They cannot be replaced. They live on in memory. They live on in identity. They live on in the story that continues, even as circumstances evolve. Matt now stands at a point where every step forward carries lasting impact. Not just for himself, but for everyone connected to what he built. Every decision will shape perception. Every decision will shape direction. Every decision will shape legacy. And legacy is not defined by control. It is defined by meaning. It is defined by what remains in the hearts of those who experienced it. Because belonging does not exist in documents. It exists in feeling. It exists in memory. It exists in the invisible connection between people and place. And that connection is what made Roloff Farms more than just land. It made it home. It made it history. It made it legacy. Right now, uncertainty still surrounds Roloff Farms. There are no clear answers. No final confirmations. Only silence, reflection, and questions that continue to linger. Fans around the world are still watching closely. Not out of curiosity alone, but out of connection. Because for years, this place has represented something deeper than property. It represented stability. It represented dreams. It represented a family story that unfolded in front of millions through little people, big world. Every memory built there still matters. Every chapter still carries meaning. And now, the future stands at a crossroads. Whatever happens next won't just affect the land. It will affect the legacy tied to it. A legacy shaped by decades of effort, sacrifice, growth, and emotional investment. For those who have followed this journey from the beginning, this moment feels different. Not like an ending, but like a turning point. Because sometimes, the most important chapters are the ones that come after everything changes. And until clarity finally arrives, one truth remains stronger than ever. People still care. They still believe. And they will continue watching, hoping that whatever comes next honors the legacy that made Roloff Farms unforgettable. The story isn't over. In many ways, it may only just be beginning.